Desmond Thomas Doss was born in 1919 in Lynchburg, Virginia, and raised in a devout Seventh-day Adventist home. Two of the commandments shaped his whole life: keep the Sabbath holy, and thou shalt not kill. He took them absolutely literally. As a boy, he had once walked 6 miles to donate blood to a stranger he had heard needed it on the radio. He grew up believing that his purpose was to save life, never to take it. Then the war came and asked him to do the opposite. He could have stayed home. His shipyard work qualified him for a deferment, but Doss believed the war was just and that he had a duty to serve. He simply refused to serve by killing. So he enlisted and asked to become a medic, a man who would go into battle to heal, not to harm. He hated the label the army gave him, Conscientious Objector, and preferred to call himself a Conscientious Cooperator. He would do everything a soldier did, share every danger, and carry no weapon. The army did not know what to do with him, so it tried to break him. In basic training, Doss was mocked, threatened, and abused. Men in his barracks threw shoes at him while he knelt to pray. Officers tried to have him declared unfit and pushed out of the army. One tried to court-martial him for refusing to carry a rifle. He would not bend, he would not touch a weapon, and he would not train on his Saturday Sabbath, and he endured all of it without ever raising a hand against anyone. The men around him were certain he would be a coward and a liability in combat, that the first time the shooting started, the man who wouldn't hold a rifle would get somebody killed. They could not have been more wrong. Before Okinawa, Doss had already proven them wrong twice, on Guam and on Leyte, running into fire to drag wounded men to safety, earning 2 Bronze Stars for valor, all without ever carrying a weapon. His company had learned something the hard way. When they were hit, Doss came for them. He would crawl out under fire to a screaming man and patch him up and haul him back, and he would do it for anyone, and he would not stop. By the time the 77th Division reached the base of Hacksaw Ridge, the men who had thrown shoes at him were glad he was there. On the 29th of April, they began to climb. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and to give this video a like, and stay with us all the way to the end. Getting onto the plateau meant climbing the cargo nets up the last sheer face of the escarpment into the teeth of the Japanese defenses. The men who reached the top found a nightmare, a cratered moonscape honeycombed with tunnels, where the enemy could pop up behind a squad that had just passed, fire, and vanish underground again. The fighting was some of the most savage of the war. Doss climbed up with Company B and did his work in the open, moving among the wounded while machine guns swept the plateau. He was, by every account, calm, not fearless, he would have said, but unwilling to let fear decide what he did. There was a particular horror to being a medic on Okinawa. The Japanese army was not a signatory to the conventions that were supposed to protect medical men, and its commanders had learned that killing a medic hurt the enemy more than killing a rifleman, because a medic's death meant every other wounded man he might have saved would die too. So the Japanese deliberately targeted medics. The Red Cross that was supposed to protect Doss instead marked him. He knew it. He went out anyway, again and again, wearing the symbol that made him a target, because the alternative was to let men die where they lay. On the 5th of May, a Saturday, Doss's Sabbath, the Japanese launched a furious counterattack across the plateau. They came out of their tunnels in strength and hit Company B hard, and the American position at the top of the cliff began to collapse. Men were falling everywhere. The order came to pull back, to get down off the plateau, back down the cargo nets, before the whole company was destroyed. The able-bodied went over the edge and down the cliff, but scattered across that plateau, in the open, under enemy fire lay dozens of wounded Americans who could not move on their own, and one man refused to leave them. Desmond Doss stayed on top of Hacksaw Ridge alone with the wounded while the enemy swarmed the plateau. He had no rifle to fight them off and no help coming. What he had was a length of rope, a knot he had learned as a boy, and a refusal to abandon a single man. At the edge of the cliff he rigged a rope sling, a kind of improvised rope litter, anchored to a shattered tree stump. Then he went out into the fire, found a wounded man, dragged him to the edge, eased him into the sling, and lowered him 400 feet down the rock face to the hands of the men waiting at the bottom. Then he turned around and went back for another. What Doss did over the next several hours is the heart of this story. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe, we're just getting to it. Because he did not do it once. He did it again and again and again, over the span of hours, alone on that plateau under fire, with no weapon and no cover. Each time he lowered a man safely down the cliff, he did not rest. He said a short prayer, the same words every time, and went back out into the killing ground for the next one. Lord, he prayed, please help me get one more. And then he would get one more. And then he would say it again. This is where the enemy becomes the witness. Doss was completely exposed the entire time. A man standing and crawling in the open on a plateau full of Japanese soldiers, doing nothing to hide, wearing no armor, carrying no weapon. By every rule of that battlefield, he should have been killed in the first few minutes. He was not. He worked for hours and was not hit. Later, the men who had been at the bottom, and Doss himself, struggled to explain it. And later still came the testimony from the other side. Japanese soldiers who said they had aimed at him and could not fire. Men who said their weapons jammed, or that they simply could not pull the trigger on the unarmed man, saving the wounded. By the time he finally stopped, Desmond Doss had lowered somewhere between 50 and 100 wounded men down that cliff, one at a time by himself. Doss, ever humble, guessed it was about 50. The men who watched him were sure it was closer to 100. When the army wrote his citation, it split the difference and set the number at 75. 75 men, many of them soldiers who had once mocked him, thrown shoes at him, called him a coward, and tried to get him thrown out of the army, were alive that night because the man who would not carry a gun would not leave them behind either. It was not the end. Over the following weeks, the battle for the escarpment ground on, and Doss kept going out for the wounded. On the night of the 21st of May, near Shuri, he was badly hurt. A Japanese grenade exploded near him and tore shrapnel through his legs. Rather than call another medic out into the fire and risk a second life, Doss treated his own wounds and waited hours for help. Then, as litter-bearers finally carried him toward safety, he saw a man more badly wounded than himself. He rolled off his own stretcher, told them to take the other man first, and waited again. It was while he waited that a sniper's bullet shattered his arm. He survived. With a shattered arm, Doss splintered the broken bone to a rifle stock, the only time in the war he is said to have held a weapon at all, and he used it as a splint, not a gun, and crawled some 300 yards over broken ground to an aid station. He had been on Okinawa for weeks of the worst fighting of the Pacific War, and he came off it carried on a litter, riddled with shrapnel, his arm broken, sick with the tuberculosis he had caught in the islands that would cost him a lung. But he had never fired a shot, and he had never let a man die alone if he could reach him. In the chaos of being wounded and evacuated, Doss lost the one possession that mattered most to him. The small Bible his wife had given him, which he had carried through every battle. When he realized it was gone, somewhere back on that bloody escarpment, he was heartbroken. And then his company did something that tells you everything about how the men who had once tormented him now felt. After the fighting there finally ended, the men of Company B went back out onto the Maeda escarpment and searched the battlefield, not for loot, not for the enemy, but for one man's lost Bible. They found it, and they mailed it home to him. On the 12th of October, 1945, Desmond Doss stood on the White House lawn in front of President Harry Truman. Truman held the Medal of Honor in his hand, looked at the quiet young medic, and said he would rather have that medal than be president. Then he placed it around Doss's neck. With it, Doss became the first conscientious objector in American history to receive the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award for combat valor, given to a man who had never taken a life. The army that had once tried to throw him out as unfit now held him up as an example of what an American soldier could be. The men who had doubted him spent the rest of their lives telling his story. One of his officers, a captain named Jack Glover, who had once tried to have Doss transferred out of the unit, put it simply. Doss, he said, was one of the bravest persons alive, and then to have him end up saving your life was the irony of the whole thing. The soldiers who had thrown shoes at the praying medic owed him their lives. And somewhere in Japan, an old man who had once held an unarmed American in his gun sight and could not fire carried that memory too, a witness on the other side to the same strange courage. Desmond Doss never fully recovered from Okinawa. He spent more than 5 years being treated for his wounds and for the tuberculosis that took one of his lungs, and he was never able to work full-time again. He never sought fame. For decades, his story lived mostly inside military history circles and his own church. He remained, to the end, a gentle and modest man who insisted he had only done what any Christian should do, that he had simply refused to let his faith bend, even when the whole world told him to. He believed God had spared his life on that cliff for a reason, and he tried to live the rest of it worthy of that. His story reached the wider world late. In 2004, a filmmaker made a documentary about him, telling it in Doss's own words. In 2016, a major motion picture, Hacksaw Ridge, brought his name to millions who had never heard it. The film's got the heart of it right. The unarmed medic, the cliff, the 75 men, the prayer for one more. But the real Desmond Doss was, if anything, quieter and stranger than any movie. A man whose whole heroism was built not on what he was willing to do to the enemy, but on what he refused to do, and on how far he would go to save a life instead. Desmond Thomas Doss died in 2006 at the age of 87 and was buried with military honors at the National Cemetery in Chattanooga, Tennessee. He held the Medal of Honor, 2 Bronze Stars for Valor, and 3 Purple Hearts, every one of them earned without ever taking a human life. On the Maeda escarpment on Okinawa today, there is a bronze tablet marking the place where he worked through the fire, one wounded man at a time. And the 75 men he lowered down that cliff went home and grew old and had children and grandchildren who exist, because a man they once called a coward would not leave them behind. A man who would not carry a gun walked into the worst battle of the Pacific and saved 75 lives with a rope and a prayer. The enemy could not bring themselves to shoot him. His own side had tried to throw him out and then owed him everything. Desmond Doss proved something the rest of us spend our lives arguing about. Desmond Doss proved thing a person can do in a war might be to refuse, absolutely, to kill. People still debate what Desmond Doss represents, whether his kind of courage is rarer than the fighting kind or just quieter, and whether more men might have carried his convictions if the world had let them. Maybe you have a view. If your father, your grandfather, your uncle, anyone in your family served as a medic or a corpsman on Okinawa or anywhere in the Pacific in any role, leave their name and what they did in the comments below. Don't just leave the name. Tell us one thing about them. One thing they did, or said, or one thing you remember. The men who went out unarmed to save the wounded deserve more than a footnote. They deserve to be remembered as people. Subscribe if you want the next story. There are more of them.